Everyone at Whitmore and Associates thought I had the perfect life. Corner office on the 32nd floor, a husband from one of Connecticut's oldest families, and a mother-in-law who sent handwritten notes on monogrammed stationery. From the outside, I looked like a woman who had figured it all out by 31. What they didn't see was that I hadn't chosen any of it. My husband's family chose the apartment in Greenwich. They chose the charity boards I sat on, the friends I was allowed to keep, the length of my hair. My mother-in-law, a woman, I will simply call what she preferred everyone call her, the matriarch, had decided the moment her son brought me home that I was a project. A rough stone to be polished into something she could display. I was a CPA. I had passed my board exams on the first try, built a client portfolio from nothing, and made senior associate before my 30th birthday. None of that impressed her. What impressed her was whether I held my fork correctly at dinner. I should have left 2 years in. I didn't, and that decision cost me more than I can put a number on. But it also gave me everything I needed to burn the whole thing down. Legally, carefully, and completely. My husband, I'll call him what he was to me, my husband. Because that's the only role that matters in this story. Was not always the man he became in that house. When we met, he was finishing his MBA at UConn and working weekends at a nonprofit that built affordable housing. He was funny. He remembered small things, the kind of man who would text you a photo of a dog he saw on his lunch break because he knew you were having a hard week. I fell in love with that man. By year 3 of our marriage, that man had almost entirely disappeared. It happened slowly, the way these things always do. A canceled dinner because his mother needed him. A vacation cut short because she had a health scare that turned out to be indigestion. Opinions that used to be his about where we would live, whether we'd start a family, how we'd spend Sunday morning slowly became hers, handed to him across the phone, and then delivered to me as though they had always been his own. I watched it happen and told myself it was temporary. I told myself he would find his footing. I told myself a lot of things in those years. What I didn't know, what took me far too long to understand, was that the erosion wasn't entirely natural. There were phone calls every morning before he was fully awake. There were lunches I wasn't invited to where family decisions were made and handed down like verdicts. And there were the pills. I didn't find out about those until the November before everything collapsed. I'm a numbers person. I notice patterns the way other people notice weather. So when my husband started sleeping 12 hours and still waking up exhausted, when his hand shook slightly during dinner, when he lost weight without trying and laughed 2 beats too late at jokes I noticed, I brought it up once and he told me he was just stressed about the Whitmore account. I brought it up again and he snapped at me in a way he never had before. Sharp, dismissive, like I was being hysterical. I let it go. For 3 weeks, I let it go. Then I found the pill organizer. It was tucked inside his toiletry bag, in a pocket I'd never opened. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for the travel-size shampoo we kept in there, for hotel stays. What I found instead was a weekly organizer, the kind with compartments labeled with days of the week, filled with capsules I didn't recognize. I photographed each compartment before I replaced it exactly as I'd found it. Then I went to work. I have a client, a retired pharmacist, who still consults on insurance fraud cases, and I reached out to her that night under the guise of needing some professional advice for a friend. I described the capsules, sent her the photos. She called me back in under an hour. What she described was a combination, a low-dose sedative with a compound that, over time, could cause the kind of cognitive fog and emotional flattening I had been watching happen to my husband for 18 months. She said it gently, the way professionals do when the news is bad. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of our bathtub for a long time. My mother-in-law had a key to our apartment. She visited twice a week while I was at the office. She had always insisted on being the one to handle my husband's supplements because, she said, he was terrible about taking his vitamins and she was just being helpful. I had thanked her for it. I did not confront her. I did not confront my husband. I did not call a lawyer that week, or cry to a friend, or do any of the things a person in a movie would do. I opened a new spreadsheet and I started documenting. Every visit she made to the apartment, logged with timestamps from the building's security system, which I had quietly asked the super to grant me access to, using my firm's insurance review as the pretext. Every prescription pickup in my husband's name that I traced through our shared health insurance portal. Every financial transfer I could find between accounts she controlled and a shell company registered in Delaware that had, as best I could tell, no legitimate business purpose. I am very good at finding things in financial records that people don't want found. By February, I had a folder. By March, it was a binder. By April, I had forwarded everything to a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, a woman I had met 3 years earlier during an audit that had unexpectedly uncovered a Ponzi scheme inside a regional credit union. We had stayed in touch. She was thorough, quiet, and extremely patient. I told her what I had, and told her what I suspected. She told me to sit tight and not change my behavior. I sat tight. For 6 more weeks, I sat tight. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was held every May at the Omni Hotel in New Haven. It was the event of my mother-in-law's social calendar. The one night where her decades of careful positioning paid off in the form of a ballroom full of the right people applauding her philanthropy. My husband and I were expected to attend, naturally. I wore a dress I had bought with my own money from an account she didn't know about, deep navy, structured, the kind of thing that does not ask permission to be noticed. My mother-in-law had sent over something from Nordstrom 2 weeks earlier, a blush-wrap dress that looked like it belonged at a baby shower, with a note that said, "I thought this would be perfect for you, darling." I left it in the dry cleaning bag. The evening started the way these evenings always started. Cocktails and careful conversation, my mother-in-law moving through the room with the practiced ease as someone who had been performing warmth for 40 years. She introduced me to people as my daughter-in-law, the accountant. The slight pause before accountant doing exactly the work she intended it to do. My husband stood beside me. He looked handsome and empty, the way he looked for the better part of a year. We found our seats. Dinner was served. The speeches began. Halfway through the second course, my mother-in-law leaned across the table and said, clearly enough for the 6 people seated nearest us to hear, "I've been meaning to ask, did you ever find a doctor to address that issue you've been having? I know how embarrassing these things can be." There was no issue. There had never been any issue. It was a sentence designed to do one thing, remind me, in front of an audience, exactly where I stood. I looked at her. And I smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a tense, swallowed smile. A real one, the kind that reaches your eyes, because I knew something she did not know, which was that my contact at the FBI had texted me 40 minutes earlier to tell me that the evening was going to go differently than my mother-in-law had planned. "I'm doing just fine," I said. "Thank you so much for asking." She blinked. Just once, the smile stayed on her face, but something behind her eyes shifted. She had expected me to redden, to deflect, to excuse myself. That was the script she had written, the one I had been following for 4 years without realizing it was a script at all. I just kept smiling and turned back to my dinner. 20 minutes later, the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. I want to be precise here, because people sometimes imagine these moments as loud and cinematic. It wasn't. 4 people in dark suits walked in, spoke briefly with the hotel manager, and then moved through the room with the kind of calm efficiency that is, in its own way, more frightening than anything dramatic. My mother-in-law saw them before they reached the table. I watched her face. I had wondered, in the months of documentation and waiting, how I would feel in this moment. Whether I would feel triumphant, or vindicated, or sad. Whether I would feel anything at all. What I felt, watching the color leave her face, was something quieter than I expected. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the release of a pressure that had been building for so long, I'd stopped noticing it was there. One of the agents asked to speak with her privately. She stood, very slowly, with the careful composure of a woman who had never once been caught doing anything. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at the table, at the board members, the donors, the people who had watched her perform grace for decades. And she offered them a small, bewildered smile, the kind that said, "This is obviously a mistake." Then she looked at me. I did not look away. The investigation took 8 months to resolve publicly, though the legal machinery had been moving much longer. The shell company in Delaware was connected to a pattern of financial fraud spanning almost 12 years. The pharmaceutical angle, what had been done to my husband, became a separate matter, handled by a different agency, one I was only peripherally involved with. My husband went into treatment in June, not because his mother asked him to, because his sister, the one sibling who had stayed genuinely close to him through everything, sat across from him at a kitchen table and told him the truth about what had been in those capsules for 18 months. He didn't call me when he found out. I didn't expect him to. I had moved out in May, 2 weeks after the gala. I had been planning the move for 3 months, quietly, the way I planned everything in those years. An apartment in Westport, a lease signed under my name alone. A handful of boxes I had been filling slowly with the things that were actually mine. People ask me sometimes whether I regret staying as long as I did. I used to not have an answer for that. What I know now is that I stayed because I kept believing the person I had fallen in love with was still in there, just obscured. And I think I was right, he was in there. I also know that it wasn't my job to excavate him. That's the thing nobody tells you about loving someone who is slowly becoming someone else. There's a point where the most honest thing you can do is stop making yourself smaller in hopes that it helps them grow. I reached that point. I just wish I'd reached it sooner. My client list at Whitmore and Associates is entirely my own now. I was made partner in October of the same year, the first person under 35 to hold that title in the firm's 22-year history. It's the kind of thing I probably would have celebrated differently once, in a different life. A dinner reservation somewhere impressive, people in nice clothes making toasts. What I actually did was go home to my apartment in Westport, make a cup of tea, and sit by the window for a long time looking at the water. I thought about the woman I had been 4 years ago, walking into a family that had already decided what role she would play. I thought about how long it took me to understand that I had always had a choice, not about what they did to me, but about how long I stayed in the room while they did it. I thought about those months of spreadsheets and timestamps and a phone kept charged and closed in case a text came through. I thought about a ballroom in New Haven and a smile that meant something no one at that table understood until it was too late. The water was very still that evening, the kind of still that comes after something has finally moved through. I finished my tea. I closed my laptop, and for the first time in longer than I could calculate, I went to sleep without waiting for anything. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the gala, not the agents walking through those doors, but the bathtub. Sitting on the edge of it with my phone in my lap after Nadia called me back, hearing her explain in careful professional language what those capsules were doing to the man I had married. That's the moment everything split in two, the life I had been trying to hold together and the one I was going to have to build from scratch. I used to think that staying was a form of loyalty. I understand now that it was something quieter and harder to name, a refusal to believe that the situation was as bad as it actually was. That kind of refusal isn't weakness exactly, but it costs you time, and time is the one thing you cannot get back. What I did in those months between finding the pill organizer and walking into the Omni Hotel in that navy dress, that was not revenge. I want to be clear about that, because revenge is reactive, and what I did was the opposite. It was deliberate. It required me to be honest with myself about what I was seeing, careful about how I documented it, and disciplined enough to sit with what I knew for 6 weeks without tipping my hand. Every morning I got up, went to work, came home, and behaved exactly as I always had. That took something out of me every single day. But here's what I've come to believe. The situations that demand the most from us tend to reveal exactly what we're made of. Catherine spent 40 years building a structure held together by control over her son, over her finances, over the people around her. She was meticulous about it, and it still collapsed because the foundation was wrong. A life built on manipulating the people who trust you is not a life that holds. It never does. The math always catches up. I built mine on something different, on showing up to work and doing it well, on being the kind of person a retired pharmacist trusted enough to call back in under an hour, on learning, during 4 years of a very difficult marriage, how to stay calm in rooms where people expected me to crumble. I didn't choose those lessons, but I used them. My husband went into treatment. I don't know who he's becoming on the other side of it, and that's not mine to know anymore. What I do know is that the person I kept waiting for him to find his way back to, I had to stop waiting. Not because I stopped caring, but because caring about someone doesn't obligate you to disappear into the wreckage of what's happening to them. I made partner in October. I sat by the window in Westport and looked at the water and thought about all of it. The spreadsheets, the timestamps, the smile. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be angry to be right. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is simply be prepared, and then let the truth do what the truth does, which is eventually find its way into the light no matter how many people have spent years trying to keep it buried. I went to sleep that night without waiting for anything. That was new. That was everything.